The Gift of Therapy, Chapter 11. The Therapeutic Act, Not the Therapeutic Word. Take advantage of opportunities to learn from patients. Make a point of inquiring often into the patient's view of what is helpful about the therapy process. Earlier, I stressed that therapists and patients do not often concur in their conclusions about the useful aspects of therapy. The patient's views of helpful events in therapy are generally relational, often involving some act of the therapist that stretched outside the frame of therapy or some graphic example of the therapist's consistency and presence. For example, one patient cited my willingness to meet with him even after he informed me by phone that he was sick with the flu. Recently, his couples therapist, fearing contagion, had cut short a session when he began sneezing and coughing. Another patient, who had been convinced that I would ultimately abandon her because of her chronic rage, told me at the end of therapy that my single most helpful intervention was my making a rule to schedule an extra session automatically whenever she had angry outbursts toward me. In another end of therapy debriefing, a patient cited an incident when, in a session just before I left on a trip, she had handed me a story she had written, and I had sent her a note to tell her how much I liked her writing. The therapy was concrete evidence of my caring, and she often turned to it for support during my absence. Checking in by phone to a highly distressed or suicidal patient takes little time and is highly meaningful to the patient. One patient, a compulsive shoplifter who had already served jail time, told me that the most important gesture in a long course of therapy was a supportive phone call I made when I was out of town during the Christmas shopping season, a time when she was often out of control. She felt she could not possibly be so ungrateful as to steal when I had gone out of my way to demonstrate my concern. If therapists have a concern about fostering dependency, they may ask the patient to participate in devising a strategy of how they can be most supported during critical periods. On another occasion, the same patient was compulsively shoplifting, but had so changed her behavior that she was now stealing inexpensive items, for example, candy bars or cigarettes. Her rationale for stealing was, as always, that she needed to help balance the family budget. This belief was patently irrational. For one thing, she was wealthy, but refused to acquaint herself with her husband's holdings. Furthermore, the amount she saved by stealing was insignificant. "What can I do to help you now?" I asked. "How do we help you get past the feeling of being poor?" "We could start with you giving me some money," she said mischievously. Whereupon I took out my wallet and gave her $50 in an envelope, with instructions to take out of it the value of the item that she was about to steal. In other words, she was to steal from me rather than the storekeeper. The intervention permitted her to cut short the compulsive spree that had taken control of her, and a month later she returned the $50 to me. From that point on, we referred often to the incident whenever she used the rationalization of poverty. A colleague told me that he had once treated a dancer who told him at the end of therapy that the most meaningful act of therapy was his attending one of her dance recitals. Another patient at the end of therapy cited my willingness to perform aura therapy. A believer in New Age concepts, she entered my office one day convinced that she was feeling ill because of a rupture in her aura. She lay down on my carpet, and I followed her instructions and attempted to heal the rupture by passing my hands from head to toe a few inches above her body. I had often expressed skepticism about various New Age approaches, and she regarded my agreeing to accede to her request as a sign of loving respect. Chapter 12. Engage in personal therapy. To my mind, personal psychotherapy is by far the most important part of psychotherapy training. Question: what is the therapist's most valuable instrument? Answer, and no one misses this one, the therapist's own self. I will discuss the rationale and the technique of the therapist's use of self from many perspectives throughout this text. Let me begin by simply stating that therapists must show the way to patients by personal modeling. We must demonstrate our willingness to enter into a deep intimacy with our patient, a process that requires us to be adept at mining the best source of reliable data about our patient, our own feelings. Therapists must be familiar with their own dark side and be able to empathize with all human wishes and impulses. A personal therapy experience permits the student therapist to experience many aspects of the therapeutic process from the patient's seat: the tendency to idealize the therapist, the yearning for dependency, the gratitude toward a caring and attentive listener, the power granted to the therapist. Young therapists must work through their own neurotic issues. They must learn to accept feedback, discover their own blind spots, and see themselves as others see them. They must appreciate their impact upon others and learn how to provide accurate feedback. Lastly, psychotherapy is a psychologically demanding enterprise, and therapists must develop the awareness and inner strength to cope with the many occupational hazards inherent in it. Many training programs insist that students have a course of personal psychotherapy. For example, some California graduate psychology schools now require 16 to 30 hours of individual therapy. That's a good start, but only a start. Self-exploration is a lifelong process, and I recommend that therapy be as deep and prolonged as possible, and that the therapist enter therapy at many different stages of life. My own odyssey of therapy over my 45-year career is as follows: a 750-hour, 5-time-a-week orthodox Freudian psychoanalysis in my psychiatric residency, with a training analyst in the conservative Baltimore Washington School, a year's analysis with Charles Rycroft, an analyst in the quote-unquote middle school of the British Psychoanalytic Institute, 2 years with Pat Baumgartner, a Gestalt therapist, 3 years of psychotherapy with Rollo May, an interpersonally and existentially oriented analyst of the William Alanson White Institute, and numerous briefer stints with therapists from a variety of disciplines, including behavioral therapy, bioenergetics, Rolfing, marital couples work, an ongoing 10-year, at this writing, leaderless support group of male therapists, and, in the 1960s, encounter groups of a whole rainbow of flavors, including a nude marathon group. Note 2 aspects of this list. First, the diversity of approaches. It is important for the young therapist to avoid sectarianism and to gain an appreciation of the strengths of all the varying therapeutic approaches. Though students may have to sacrifice the certainty that accompanies orthodoxy, they obtain something quite precious: a greater appreciation of the complexity and uncertainty underlying the therapeutic enterprise. I believe there is no better way to learn about a psychotherapy approach than to enter into it as a patient. Hence, I have considered a period of discomfort in my life as an educational opportunity to explore what various approaches have to offer. Of course, the particular type of discomfort has to fit the method. For example, behavioral therapy is best suited to treat a discrete symptom. Hence, I turned to a behaviorist to help with insomnia, which occurred when I traveled to give lectures or workshops. Secondly, I entered therapy at many different stages of my life. Despite an excellent and extensive course of therapy at the onset of one's career, an entirely different set of issues may arrive at different junctures of the life cycle. It was only when I began working extensively with dying patients in my 4th decade that I experienced considerable explicit death anxiety. No one enjoys anxiety, and certainly not I, but I welcomed the opportunity to explore this inner domain with a good therapist. Furthermore, at the time I was engaged in writing a textbook, Existential Psychotherapy, and I knew that deep personal exploration would broaden my knowledge of existential issues. And so I began a fruitful and enlightening course of therapy with Rollo May. Many training programs offer, as part of the curriculum, an experiential training group, that is, a group that focuses on its own process. These groups have much to teach, though they are often anxiety-provoking for participants, and not easy for the leaders either. They have to get a handle on the student members' competitiveness and their complex relationships outside the group. I believe that the young psychotherapist generally profits even more from a quote-unquote stranger experiential group, or better yet, an ongoing high-functioning psychotherapy group. Only by being a member of a group can one truly appreciate such phenomena as group pressure, the relief of catharsis, the power inherent in the group leader role, the painful but valuable process of obtaining valid feedback about one's interpersonal presentation. Last, if you are fortunate enough to be in a cohesive, hard-working group, I assure you that you will never forget it, and will endeavor to provide such a therapeutic group experience for your future patients. Chapter 13. The therapist has many patients. The patient, one therapist. There are times when my patients lament the inequality of the psychotherapy situation. They think about me far more than I think about them. I loom far larger in their lives than they do in mine. If patients could ask any question they wished, I am certain that, for many, that question would be, "Do you ever think about me?" There are many ways to address this situation. For one, keep in mind that, though the inequality may be irritating for many patients, it is at the same time important and necessary. We want to loom large in the patient's mind. Freud once pointed out that it is important for the therapist to loom so large in the patient's mind that the interactions between the patient and the therapist begin to influence the course of the patient's symptomatology. That is, the psychoneurosis becomes gradually replaced by a transference neurosis. We want the therapy hour to be one of the most important events in the patient's life. Though it is not our goal to do away with all powerful feelings toward the therapist, there are times when the transference feelings are too dysphoric, times when the patient is so tormented by feelings about the therapist that some decompression is necessary. I am apt to enhance reality testing by commenting upon the inherent cruelty of the therapy situation. The basic nature of the arrangement dictates that the patient think more about the therapist than vice versa. The patient has only one therapist, while the therapist has many patients. Often I find the teacher analogy useful, and I point out that the teacher has many students, but the students have only one teacher, and, of course, students think more about their teacher than she about them. If the patient has had teaching experience, this may be particularly relevant. Other relevant professions, for example, physician, nurse, supervisor, also may be cited. Another aid I have often used is to refer to my personal experience as a psychotherapy patient by saying something like, "I know it feels unfair and unequal for you to be thinking of me more than I of you, for you to be carrying on long conversations with me between sessions, knowing that I do not similarly speak in fantasy to you. But that's simply the nature of the process. I had exactly the same experience during my own time in therapy, when I sat in the patient's chair and yearned to have my therapist think more about me." Chapter 14. The Here and Now. Use it, use it, use it. The here and now is the major source of therapeutic power, the pay dirt of therapy, the therapist's and hence the patient's best friend. So vital for effective therapy is the here and now that I shall discuss it more extensively than any other topic in this text. The here and now refers to the immediate events of the therapeutic hour, to what is happening here, in this office, in this relationship, in the in-betweenness, the space between me and you, and now, in this immediate hour. It is basically an ahistoric approach, and de-emphasizes, but does not negate the importance of, the patient's historical past or events of his or her outside life. Chapter 15. Why use the here and now? The rationale for using the here and now rests upon a couple of basic assumptions. 1. The importance of interpersonal relationships, and 2. The idea of therapy as a social microcosm. To the social scientist and the contemporary therapist, interpersonal relationships are so obviously and monumentally important that to belabor the issue is to run the risk of preaching to the converted. Suffice it to say that regardless of our professional perspective, whether we study our non-human primate relatives, primitive cultures, the individual's developmental history, or current life patterns, it is apparent that we are intrinsically social creatures. Throughout life, our surrounding interpersonal environment, peers, friends, teachers, as well as family, has enormous influence over the kind of individual we become. Our self-image is formulated to a large degree upon the reflected appraisals we perceive in the eyes of the important figures in our life. Furthermore, the great majority of individuals seeking therapy have fundamental problems in their relationships. By and large, people fall into despair because of their inability to form and maintain enduring and gratifying interpersonal relationships. Psychotherapy based on the interpersonal model is directed toward removing the obstacles to satisfying relationships. The second postulate, that therapy is a social microcosm, means that eventually, provided we do not structure it too heavily, the interpersonal problems of the patient will manifest themselves in the here and now of the therapy relationship. If, in his or her life, the patient is demanding or fearful or arrogant or self-effacing or seductive or controlling or judgmental or maladaptive interpersonally in any other way, then these traits will enter into the patient's relationship with the therapist. Again, this approach is basically ahistoric. There is little need of extensive history taking to apprehend the nature of maladaptive patterns, because they will soon enough be displayed in living color in the here and now of the therapy hour. To summarize, the rationale for using the here and now is that human problems are largely relational, and that an individual's interpersonal problems will ultimately be manifested in the here and now of the therapy encounter.